You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good, man. I just had my pre-show snack, as I always have a pre-show snack. Today it was coffee and Pop-Tarts.
That's the snack of champions.
Yeah. What's your favorite Pop-Tart?
You know, I'm pretty boring. I like a good, just plain strawberry Pop-Tart. No frosting. You know, healthy as all things should be.
Oh, yeah. Pop-Tarts are real healthy if they don't have icing, right?
Yeah, that's the trick to make sure you're cutting calories in the appropriate locations of your diet. What's yours?
Well, I have to have icing. The only ones I ever eat are cherry Pop-Tarts. My kids think they're disgusting. And
they're
that's
right.
Also part of the strategy, right? They think they're disgusting, so they don't eat them.
You know, that reminds me of kind of like, you know, your grandparents who like licorice candy. Like, that's disgusting. There's no way I'm going to eat that. And I guess it leaves more for them.
More for them.
Yeah. So why don't we get into our topic today? We're going to talk about a recent report that came out from the Identity Defined Security Alliance. It is the 2021 Trends in Security Digital Identities. And we have with us again our three-time reigning champion guest of appearances, Julie Smith. Welcome to the show, Julie.
Hey, thanks, Jim and Jeff. I am honored and humbled to be the reigning champion of your show, and I truly appreciate the support that you've given in the IDSA over the last, has it been a year yet? Maybe not quite.
Yeah, so you appeared back in our first episode with you would have been back in August of 2020. So I guess we're kind of coming up on the anniversary of that. You were with us for Identity Management Day back in April of this year. And then here you are on your third visit. And, you know, we see your couch in the background here as we have video for recording an audio podcast, but just for, you know, giggles, we might see Sly the cat jumping up in the background, who has yet to grace us with an appearance. So maybe third time will be a charm. We'll see how it goes.
It is highly likely. I did just bribe him a little while ago with some food to kind of keep him quiet. He, in particular, is a fan of brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts. Not exactly the diet of champion for cats either, but definitely his favorite flavor.
All things in moderation, right? I mean, that's really the key to anything.
No doubt.
So we answered the Pop-Tart question, and I think, you know, we got one right answer, which is obviously mine and not your guys's. But what have you guys been up to? From an IDSA perspective, but also yourself. I mean, what have you been up to since the last time you were on here in April for Identity Management Day?
Yeah, it's that's 2 months ago now, isn't it? A lot of things going on. When I was here before, and it was myself and the executive director from the National Cybersecurity Alliance, Kelvin Coleman, who is awesome, and we partnered with him on Identity Management Day. The results of that were fantastic. You know, the day itself, I think we might have done the podcast just the day before. The day itself, I felt I was just so invigorated by it all, seeing the messages around, you know, the importance of this day. How did we not have this day? Companies kind of coming out of the woodwork and sharing resources that they made available on Identity Management Day. And, you know, we had a couple of great webinars in the morning and in the afternoon. And, you know, I think I was a bit overwhelmed with the support and the success of it. So that was fantastic. And then, you know, one of the other things that's been going on is we have 28 companies that are members of our organization, and they have an opportunity to present some thought leadership content on our platform, the IDSA platform. And so we've been running a webinar about every 3 weeks from one of our members, and you know, not product pitches, but wanting to keep it in the spirit of the IDSA, very vendor neutral. So, you know, people should check those out. So, you know, super excited to say that we've got something going about every 3 weeks all the way through the end of the year. And then, working on sort of the next thing with the National Cybersecurity Alliance and NIST. So we're hopefully this isn't pre-announcing, but we've got a thing that we're working on, a virtual event. Sadly, we're still sort of in virtual mode, I think, for a bit, around zero trust. That's going to be a public-private sector, hour and a half session or so, and we'll talk about zero trust from the customer perspective, and we'll talk about it from the perspective of those folks that are involved in building out the reference architectures that we're seeing from NIST and we're seeing from IDSA, and also, what the IDSA is doing around identity-centric zero trust. So, good stuff in the last couple of months and going into the end of the summer as well.
Are you guys doing anything around Identiverse, which is in transparency taking place this week, and this show will air the Monday after Identiverse? Anything going on from an Identiverse perspective?
Yeah, we did a session yesterday morning. It was a virtual session. That was a readout of the research report. So, if you're interested in getting firsthand feedback from Clint Maples, who is the CISO of Robert Half, Bernard Diebecker, who is the Chief Enterprise Security Architect at Intuit, and then the researcher, Dimensional Research, and Diane Hagelin moderated that session. It was a great discussion, and kind of good to get that sort of real world perspective on the results of the research. I will tell you though that it was a bit stressful for me because Clint had some computer issues at the last minute and showed up about 5 minutes into the session. So as you can imagine, my blood pressure was pretty high, but it was a great discussion. And so for anybody that maybe wants to tap into all the virtual content from Identiverse after the fact, check it out. And I was actually physically out there yesterday. So it was nice to see that things are at least starting to get back to normal amongst the Identerati.
You guys are doing so much, and we are the vendor neutral podcast. So a lot of times we have guests come on from vendors, and we always let them know, the podcast is not an infomercial. But I think, when it comes to IDSA or some of the other nonprofit kind of trade organizations, if you will, I guess that's probably the proper classification. But, organizations that are out there trying to build the community and trying to, increase the level of all boats, all ships rise together kind of thing. I think we're more than happy to be a vehicle for that. And I remember, I think that speaks to why, we've invited you to come back, and this being your third trip on the show. I remember the first time we spoke, you talked about kind of one of the main things that you wanted to do with the IDSA was produce content, right, for the IAM practitioner, which is pretty much our same mission on the podcast. But one of the things is I just love the content that you're putting out. I follow you on LinkedIn, and I would recommend for all of our listeners to follow you on LinkedIn. I'm not sure if you have any other channels you do the same thing on. But, I think it's probably 2, 3, 4 times a week you're putting up a post with new content that your members are creating. And it's fantastic content, anything from blogs to webinars, all the things that you're talking about. But most recently, and kind of what a lot of the timing for having you back on the show is about, is your latest research paper. And so that was called, I believe, 2021 Trends in Securing Digital Identities. Hopefully I got that right. Maybe you could tell us what that paper is all about, and who did you talk to in order to put it together?
Yeah, and thanks for that endorsement, Jim. I truly appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, just in terms of other channels, at IDS Alliance is our Twitter handle. So try to follow that as well. Do publish a lot to LinkedIn. Bright Talk is where we have a number of our webinars published currently, and then some of them have also made it out to YouTube as well. So lots of different vehicles to get at our content. And our technical working group which consists of, super smart people from all of our member companies, are all the ones that are really helping to drive a lot of the content we're producing. So thankful to those guys and gals for what they do, and appreciate the feedback on the content. But yeah, research is one of the things that we started focusing on in December of 2019. And so this will be our fourth research report that we've published. And last year, when we published a similar report called Identity Security: A Work in Progress, we sort of had this idea that, this is a report that could become an annual, sort of aspirational Verizon data breach incident report, only focused specifically on identity. And so, that was sort of the thought coming out of May of last year when we published the first one. What we did with this report is we pulled questions from our first research, which was focused on organizational aspects of managing identity inside organizations, and what's the relationship between identity and security teams, budgets, priorities, ownership. So there were a number of questions that were pulled into this report from that report, and that report was actually called State of Identity: How Security Teams Are Addressing Risk. And then we repeated a lot of the questions from last year's Identity Security report. So it was a little bit of a combination of things, and this is hopefully, like I said, the first of many. I mentioned earlier Dimensional Research. They were a third-party research firm that supported this report, and we work with them on a set of questions, and then they provide us with folks that are qualified security leaders. We had more than 500 respond, identity and security leaders, I should say. We had more than 500 respond to the results, or to the survey itself. They were kind of across the industry spectrum, and larger organizations, so 1,000 employees or more. And they were willing to sit down and take the survey, and then we compiled the results and wrote up the research report, kind of highlighting the key findings from the report itself. So that was sort of the methodology behind it.
That's great.
Yeah, super happy with just the data that we received.
I mean, 500 people is an impressive number to me. I mean, when you see a lot of the recurring surveys that are done, the population of users is usually far less than that. How did you get 500 people that are in this space? How did you even identify them?
So that's part of what we pay the research firm for, quite honestly. The questions themselves are sort of a combination of art and science, and they certainly help us craft them to make sure that we're asking the right questions. And, I think every year we try and hone them a little bit better. But yeah, they are the ones that, they've got this great database of people that just enjoy doing this. There may be a little compensation going on behind the scenes, not sure exactly, but they bring those folks to the table for us.
I would imagine if you're listening, you've probably gotten LinkedIn pings and email pings from people who are kind of researchers and things like that. I would imagine that's kind of the process. Turning to the report itself, I think one of the first findings was really not a shocker for me, I guess, and that was that remote work had significantly impacted identity security. And to me, it's like, okay, well, no, duh, right? Of course it did. One thing that I thought was interesting about that kind of overall section was that the confidence in the ability for identity security to be appropriate actually fell going into this. So I think it was something like 50-50 before, and then it moved down to about a third or so who were less. So basically, as we went into COVID, people were less confident that their identity security was where it needed to be for a remote situation. And I think that came out in, some of the conversations, at least that we had, through our normal course of work, where we saw a lot of organizations really starting to stand up their remote worker capabilities, VPNs, MFAs, all the technologies that people would need to work remotely where, maybe they haven't had to do that before. And I'm curious, what are some of the takeaways that you took out from I guess, from that high level section about just the impact that the remote work had on identity.
It's interesting because just anecdotally, you talk to your friends about how has this impacted you, and it's kind of weird to say, hasn't really impacted me that much, right? I mean, obviously, when I'm just thinking about how do I work and what I do day to day, it does. A lot of us in the technology space, I think, have worked from home, whether it's full time or part time. So it didn't really affect us, but us as individuals. But the results of the survey said that 80% say the shift to remote work put an increased focus on identity security. And so obviously, overnight it changed our world as employees, right? Where all of a sudden, for those people that went into an office every single day, now all of a sudden they're working from home. They're maybe logging in from their personal laptop. They're using their daughter's iPad, whatever sort of mechanism they could to get access to the applications and things that they need to do their daily job. So, I think there's been so much in the news around this that it wasn't too much of a surprise to say that, big chunk of companies, a majority of companies said there was an increased focus on it. The stat you mentioned was the confidence and ability to secure employee identities. So we had asked the question in 2020 around how confident are you in managing different types of identities. So we gave them sort of we privileged users, just employees, which, some could say those have a bit of an overlap. We asked about machines and service accounts and those kind of things. And everyone pretty much stayed the same, except for we saw a big drop in employee identities, and we saw an increase in service accounts, I believe was the stat, a little bit of an increase in confidence, which was kind of interesting. Sort of wondering, maybe all of a sudden they started paying more attention to that type of identity. I know we have been advocating very much that it's not just human identities, it is machine identities, it's service accounts, it's, these non-human identities that people need to pay attention to. And then I would say that the other stat that was part of that sort of remote work question set had to do with an increase in the number of identities. So did you see an increase in the number of identities managed in the last year due to COVID? And we had 83% came back with yes, there was an increase, and it varied in terms of what percentages, but they were having to manage more identities. And I think about it, everybody kind of has a different perspective on this one. I think about it as a lot of organizations, especially that have they have a customer facing side of things where maybe in the past they hadn't necessarily offered services or online applications to those customers. Now all of a sudden had to figure out how do they continue to drive business for their organization online. And they maybe hadn't considered that before. So I think customer identities certainly played into that, and maybe just more focus on managing identities in general, just because of the nature of the environment and things that were going on.
The takeaway I had from what you were just going through there was around the service accounts, because service accounts have the beautiful attributes of being not well managed generally, in terms of people are even afraid to change the passwords on those things. But a lot of times they're extremely powerful, more powerful than the human accounts. So they just sit there as an especially appetizing threat vector for the adversaries, if you will. But I wanted to kind of hit on key finding number 2 in the report, which is when you think, and I'm using words like adversaries with a point, because that's what you hear about with the malware and the ransomware attacks, and some of those are generally started with identity management or lost credentials or stolen credentials. But even those that start with, opening up an email or something like that, in order for them to be truly successful, generally escalate into some kind of privilege-based or credential-based attack. But one of so the second finding in the report was around breaches. Still prevalent. In other words, I think everybody who has a TV and or looks at a newspaper knows these things are front and center. uh, but investments in targeted prevention are accelerating.
So we did ask a question in addition to, so yeah, to your point, what we did find, and we asked two different questions last year. One was related to an identity related breach in the last 2 years, and the other one was identity related breach with no time frame, right? No limitation or time box on the question. And so what interestingly we have found that there was it was flat. I mean, so 79% in both the 2020 and 2021 reports, and I think 95%. When that was for 2 years, 2 year time frame, 95% versus 94% for just the untime boxed question, if you will. But then we also asked the impact. So, what was the impact of that breach? In addition to the different types. And, I thought it was interesting that malicious attacks made up about 40% of the identity related breaches. Business suffered a period where IT systems were unavailable. So, and that was 32%. I think where you might have been going, Jim, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is around ransomware. And a little less than a quarter came back and said the result of that identity related breach was ransomware.
I think one thing that stuck out for me as I was looking through the report was, yeah, breaches are consistent. At least a number, and this stat of around 80%, 79%, right? It lines up with what we've seen from other reporting from Verizon, from IBM, and the Ponemon Institute. What I thought was interesting from your report was that the only type of breach that was up, or at least from an identity perspective, was phishing. Everything else was relatively flat or maybe just slightly down. So it really does go back to the identity where, what are people looking for from a phishing perspective? They're trying to get you to enter IDs and passwords, into systems that maybe are not necessarily the right system to be doing that in. And that's where technologies like MFA and other, secondary factors, right, can kind of help mitigate some of that. So I thought it was interesting that there was much more focus on phishing, which I think helps with the ransomware type of things. And that's typically how, a lot of organizations are, making the newspaper or the TV for the wrong reasons. Have you had any feedback from any of your, partners from the organization perspective? Have they kind of shared similar findings, or they see something different?
In terms of the causes of breaches, or
I think the trend of just, there's the technology in place to kind of stop some of the technical breaches, but the identity related things, right? You can't stop someone from putting an ID and a password on a Post-it note and then taking a screenshot of it and putting it on Twitter because they're in a Twitter fight with someone else. Not referencing something that happened in the U.S. government recently, but that type of scenario, right? Identity in the human is usually the weakest link.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think everything that we advocate for at the IDSA is all around reducing the damage. Right. So what are ways that if someone, I think that there's a bit of a cliche out there. It's not if, but when a breach is going to happen. And it's going to be, according to the Verizon data breach incident report, 80% of the time, it's going to be related to a compromised credential. So how do you limit the damage or even, prevent the possibility of that credential being used in a way that could be damaging to the organization? So, we're all about, to your point, you cannot, you can't control human behavior, right? And I think all the training in the world, is going to help some, but people are distracted, especially in the environment that we live in today, where there's just so much information coming at us on a daily basis, and then with COVID, our sort of work world is disrupted, and I think it's going to happen. So how do you prevent it? How do you limit the damage, I guess? I had a good friend, spearfishing related anecdote, a good friend who had an email sent to HR with account information and routing information, and it was spoofed from his account. And HR called him up and said, "Hey, I just got this email from you that said, that gave me new bank information that you would change banks and you wanted me to change your direct deposit. Just wanted to confirm that with you." And he was like, "Yeah, nope, that did not come from me." So they're getting smarter for sure, and that's a little bit different type of approach. But we're, I think, just given the nature of everything that we do online, we're all susceptible.
Yeah, absolutely. If you ever, for kicks, want to go out and Google the word Evil Jinx, EVILGINX, and the number two, you'll see that's a well known hacking framework that you can basically um, mod out or present yourself as a authentication screen from very well known IDPs like Instagram, Office 365. They have an Okta plugin, like all kinds of different ones to just make it look like you are logging into an application you log into all the time. Oh, but here's the second one. They can also capture your two factor. So if you have a one time password that gets issued as part of that authentication. And what they're basically doing is a man in the middle attack where they're capturing your credentials. They'll post those credentials into the real website. Then the real website will send you a multi factor authentication one time password. You'll enter that into that man in the middle attack. It will pass it on to the site, and then it'll redirect you to the site with the session token. So it looks like you legitimately logged in and ended up on the site logged in as you expected. But at the meantime, the hacker also has your session token and can log in as you. And by the way, they have your password, so they can go ahead and change your profile. It's really scary stuff. So, but I thought it was interesting what you were saying. So you almost have to be in the position where you say, well, if the hackers are able, they don't even have to be that sophisticated, because that Evil Jinx platform is something that a script kiddie, right? Somebody who's like a kid who's into hacking can go out and download and get all these things running on a virtual machine. It doesn't take a computer science degree to kind of be able to pull something like this off. You're going to get hacked at some point. So then the question is like, how do you deal with it? My advice is you almost have to treat a ransomware attack or a data breach like a disaster. And with disasters, you do disaster recovery planning. You obviously hope a disaster never hits, but you build a disaster recovery plan with a communications plan and how you're going to get in touch with people, who's responsible for what. And then you test that plan on a regular basis. I think that organizations should be doing the same thing when it comes to data breaches and ransomware. Expect that the problem is going to happen. Do what you can to limit it, but be prepared and know what you're going to do if and when it does happen.
It's we see a lot of hacking as a service now. This is something that's very popular with ransomware, where it's basically you're paying the bad guys as a service to say, here's what I want, here's what I want to go after, and just manage it for me. And it's like the complete opposite of what everyone wants. I think one of the things I thought was important, or at least interesting from this meeting also or this report, was that security is really becoming is much more of a broader part of identity. And I think that leads kind of one of the third main point that we kind of saw through this report. And what I thought was interesting was specifically around the ownership around identity and access management. So when it comes to identity management, I think there's a lot of organizations where it's part of their information security group, and they kind of run it on their own. And they might have some help from some other areas, but maybe they run it themselves. Other organizations, it's very distributed. Everyone kind of does their own thing, and then either security or compliance are kind of the checkers after the fact, which may or may not be too late when things have happened. I'm curious from the report, if maybe you can kind of talk about what has been the impact from the security perspective onto identity management, and if there's any other key findings that you think were important to bring up.
In the 2019 report, I mentioned the state of identity was the report where we focused sort of around ownership and the organizational elements of identity and security teams. And we asked a question at that time that was, does the security team have ownership or involvement with identity management? And what we got back at that time, 2019 December, was 53% said they had some ownership level of identity, and that's the security team, right? and then we asked a little bit different question in this year's report, and it was very specific to CISO. And the question was, uh, what level of involvement does the CISO have relative to the identity management activities, initiatives, I guess I should call them. And we asked it around strategy only, strategy and implementation, implementation only. And if you combine all those things together, we found that 87% said the CISO, so not security team, but the CISO had some level of ownership. And we had a conversation about it yesterday during Identiverse, and as we were preparing for that session, and one of the things that Clint talked about is strategy. He firmly believes that the CISO should own the strategy side of it. And again, this is coming from one CISO who has had both operations and strategy ownership in the past. His feeling was that implementation is pretty challenging and may take away from the strategy side of things. And so, his thought was, gosh, if I'm gonna look at this and say, what am I going to take away from that? I'm going to take away, and just given his experience too, combined with the research, that I should own strategy as a CISO for the identity initiatives in the organization. So, I thought that was an interesting statistic, is that's a ginormous shift if you think about it, right? From 53% of the security teams to 87% of the organization say that CISOs have a leadership role. And then, we also did a little bit of a slice of the data and found that when the CISO does have ownership, they are further along in implementing identity defined security outcomes. And those are, we use terminology that wasn't specific to what we've developed, even though that's really what we surveyed on. So if you go to our website, you'll find a library of about 19 identity defined security outcomes. And they really are a combination of identity and security technologies that come together and help you become more secure. And so there are outcomes that organizations may be looking to achieve to improve their security posture. And then there's approaches which are different implementation patterns, if you will, to achieve those specific outcomes. So, certainly when the CISO has leadership and ownership of identity strategies, they're farther along in implementing those outcomes. So, that just gives you a little bit more insight into the evolution of how identity and security are coming together, and not the recognition that is just a primary attack vector that needs to be shut down. But I think it also gives the CISO an opportunity to get additional investment around identity initiatives. And certainly identity is a key element of digital transformation initiatives, right? So that was one of the things we didn't talk about. We talked about the shift to remote work, but a lot of organizations, and this comes from some of our member companies who are more system integrators, said that just the acceleration around digital transformation initiatives, moving to the cloud, putting applications out there for your customers and partners in order to continue operations, was through the roof in this past year. So, everything that we went through with the pandemic had sort of a good side and a bad side, right? And I think the good side was just this focus on identity security and the opportunity that's there, I think, for accelerated investment and focus from the CISO, and giving the CISO an opportunity to participate in the business in a broader way.
So I'll share my experience on different CISO types. The first is the CISO who does not have any operational responsibilities. So somebody who's responsible for policy, strategy, etc. Then you have CISOs who do security system operations, but not IAM. And then the third would be the CISOs that have IAM. I think there's this balance, right? Because what I've seen of CISOs who do strategy but don't have any operations is that they tend to be somewhat weaker within the organization. I'm sure this varies from organization to organization, but folks who don't have any operational capabilities don't have a very extensive staff, don't own systems, and are sometimes marginalized because of the size of their organization relative to, say, somebody who is in the applications team or the ERP team who has a team of 50 or 100 people and a budget to match that, right? So if you don't have very much in terms of operations, you probably also don't have very much budget and the ability to influence decisions based on how you spend your budget. On the other end of the spectrum, I've seen CISOs who have very large departments and have a large responsibility in terms of IAM, and I think the the potential conflict there is that they're setting policies for security requirements that sometimes when you place those security requirements on new technology rollouts or technology updates, it can interfere with the timeline commitments that you've made. So you might say, we're going to go live by October 1st, and then the CISO says, well, you haven't done your security scanning and you haven't done this, that, and the other, and I'm going to prevent you from going live. Now imagine the scenario where that IAM platform is in that same scenario, because IAM projects can be very complex and can run into these problems, and I have that experience in my own world, where now you're the CISO, you're the owner of the platform, but you also have the responsibility to enforce policies which will result in you missing your commitment. Now, I'm not saying you're not going to do what's right for the company, whatever you believe that to be, but I think it's a conflict of interest, right? You're supposed to enforce the laws on yourself that are going to cause you to fail in another aspect of your responsibility. So I'm not saying there's one right answer, but I think, Jeff and I, when what we do, we get asked the question all the time, okay, who should own IAM? And I don't think there's one right answer. It might be the CISO, it might not be the CISO. Kind of depends on the organization, but I think whichever route you choose, there's that trade-off.
Yeah, so I'm curious about if can I ask you a question?
Sure. Yeah, please.
So the I was looking at the specifics of that particular question, and 4% came back and said the CISO was not at all involved in identity and access management. I think that was one of the archetypes you mentioned. But given the environment and given just the last 6, 8, I don't know, maybe 10 years now that compromised credentials are the leading attack vector for hackers, doesn't that seem a little
terrifying,
insane, I was going to say, but yeah, that there wouldn't be a security lens on identity and access management within some organizations.
So with that 4%, I'd be interested to know, are they not involved at all, or does it mean they don't own it? I think to not have them at all involved, I think that is terrifying because there's so many security requirements when it comes to IAM. I mean, but what we sometimes see is that IAM might be owned by like a customer support group or desktop support, things like that. And it's usually, okay, this is the group with the operations. They run the help desk. They have all the infrastructure people. They support the desktops, and they always thought of IAM fitting in there. And then, do you take that away from somebody and plant it over here with the CISO? Many organizations have done that. I mean, think back 15 years ago, how many organizations even had CISOs? It wasn't that common. I mean, I worked at a $10 billion company that did not have a CISO, whatever, 20 years ago. So over time, but that company was still doing identity and access management, whether they knew it or not, right? And some organizations are very good about realigning capabilities under the right leader, or what they believe the right leader to be. Other organizations, don't rock the boat.
Yeah, so 4% CISO is not involved. 9% CISO is consulted but does not have ownership. So we did ask a question as well around that. So
that 4% of CISO not involved might be they might not have a CISO. There are some organizations that, I think it's less and less every year. There's some organizations that still don't put a lot of stock in information security. But an organization with over 1,000 employees that doesn't have a CISO.
I look forward to reading about them in the paper. Because you know what's coming. It could be also too there. It just might be a visibility issue, right? A lot of times there might be levels of abstraction, whether it's management or teams, and I would find it really surprising that a CISO does not have identity somewhere as part of their security strategy, whatever it may be. But Jim's right. I mean, you have a company that may not have a CISO, and maybe they just call it something else, so maybe it could be nomenclature. But I guess the good news is, if we want to put a silver lining on that, is that it's only 4%. So maybe we look at it, 96% of the companies do have a CISO that is engaged with it. So this was a really good report, and we're going to have a link to this in our show notes so people can kind of check it out. But before we start to wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways or kind of overall report thoughts? How do you see this kind of being a 30-second elevator speech that you might give to somebody, Julie, where, what should they take away from this report?
Yeah, I think, we kind of hit on the high level themes throughout it, right? It's that, remote work has had a significant impact on identity security, right? It's interesting. I've been in the business since 2008, and that was also the last time that there was a negative event in the financial situation we had in 2008 that put a spotlight on identity and access management, with all of the movement to the cloud and companies looking for ways to contain costs. So, here is another, unfortunate situation in our world, but has put a significant spotlight on identity security. It's interesting. I think, that breaches are flat year over year. So there's some improvements being made somewhere, and they're still prevalent, but, investments are in the targeted prevention are certainly accelerating. And I think, with the involvement of the CISO, whether it's owning strategy and implementation or owning just strategy, there is an opportunity for organizations to take advantage of this spotlight and really invest in identity and access management. I think that just benefits everybody from a security perspective, and from a experience perspective for employees and customers and partners, and gives CISO an opportunity to take a bigger seat at the table.
It's right there in front of folks, and hopefully they take advantage of that opportunity and really kind of take it seriously. So we're trying something new this episode, and that is we had a little bit of a live audience that was listening to the show as we were recording it, and we decided to try this out, see how it works, and ask people for questions that they might have had as they were kind of listening to the conversation, and try to get more involvement that way. And one that came through that I especially like was people wondering how can they get involved with the IDSA. Julie, is that something that you give some direction to the folks who are listening to?
Yeah, sure. And I love that question, because hopefully that means that we're doing some of the right things. So, at this point in time, I think the best way to get involved, honestly, is to, we talked earlier about social, the social channels that we're publishing content on. So if you're seeing things that you like, please share them with your colleagues. This is very much a sort of a peer-to-peer type organization, where we're looking for ways to get people connected, and by using our content as sort of the primary focus. So, if you read a blog you like, share, comment, send it off to your colleagues. Use the identity defined security outcome library that we've made available. And if you're using it in ways that are informing your roadmap, making you more secure, tell those stories. There is a forum out on idsalliance.org is the website, and sign up for the forum and share your stories there. We would love to get more people engaged and sharing information about how they're using our content and the successes that they've had, whether it's around implementing identity-centric zero trust or any of the identity security outcomes or the best practices. So, we're really hoping for people to engage with us in that way, and sign up for our mailing list, and we'll be sending out newsletters and such that's sort of a roundup of all the content that we're providing as well. So, I think it's really about sharing your experience with the IDSA.
We had another question from the audience, and they're asking if you see any challenges to remote work becoming more of a full-time, I guess, role or opportunity for people who are out there.
Yeah, I think and this is Julie speaking. I mean, if you read the news lately, there's certainly a lot of a buzz around folks that don't want to go back to the office for various reasons, right? So I think remote work is here to come. I have a neighbor who said, I've really loved remote working. I'm at a point in my career where I'll just retire if they make me go back to the office. So I think remote, it's interesting how the pendulum swings, right? But I think remote work is here to stay for a while. I think a lot of companies, were forced into figuring it out and just got it done, and probably have a lot of work to go back and do and clean up and make sure that whatever mechanism they used to give their employees access from home, they're making that secure. And so, I would just point back to some of the content that we've got out on the idsalliance.org website. Certainly the outcomes can help securing remote work. Remote workers we have a white paper that's specifically focused on some scenarios, common scenarios around the remote work scenario and how to apply identity defined security outcomes to make those interactions more secure. So I think it's not going away, at least for the foreseeable future, and we'll do all we can to help organizations make that more secure, make themselves more secure.
I think if there's one thing that I learned over the last year is that for the vast majority of people, you can absolutely work remotely. Whether it's secure or not, I think is not the question, because there are absolutely ways to secure it. I just think back to the dozens of years where people were told, nope, you need to be in the office. That's how you're going to be most productive and effective, and blah blah blah, right? And the last year has really forced the hand of a lot of people who maybe have that older style of thinking where, you can work remote. In some cases, you're far more efficient. I don't know anybody who likes to sit in traffic for an hour getting into the office, one way or however long your commute is. That's time can be spent. I think the downside to it, though, is the lines have been blurred between office time and not office time, right? I think we found there's been plenty of stats that have been put out there of research over the last year where people are actually working more than they would normally be in the office, because that distinction has been blurred. So I think it's interesting, and there's probably also some context maybe around certain areas where call centers and things like that. I think they've traditionally kind of been already a mix of remote work as well as being in a central location. So I think there are certainly some opportunities out there for hopefully some folks to kind of rethink, right, how are they going to secure this, because I do think that the remote work is strategic for a lot of companies, and it's going to become more strategic over the next several months as we see sort of this wave of people who are willing to make job changes because they're not getting what they want from a remote work standpoint. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's stuff like that will kind of push the boundary, and sometimes you need a push to get where you want to go. So I think we've certainly run a little bit long today, but we had a really good conversation, and I do want to start to wrap things up and let people get on with their day. But it wouldn't be an Identity at the Center podcast without a question out of nowhere that has no relevance whatsoever to identity. And what I want to know is from you, Julie, what song or band have you had on repeat recently?
Yes, you guys are very good at coming up with sort of the obscure question. So I recently watched a documentary on, might have been on Amazon, about Pink. And I think that had led me to putting her music on repeat to and I believe the name of the documentary is That's All I Know So Far, which that song has continued to pop up. I also think it's a kind of an interesting way to end this by saying that's all I know so far. So that's my playlist for right now.
My wife's a Pink fan. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of the music, although I appreciate the talent. I got to tell you, I have been addicted to the Struts for the last several weeks. Since our episode with Eric Anderson from Adobe several weeks back, I had forgotten just how good those guys are. So I've been watching, and I've actually been watching live concerts, and the guy just gives off such a great performance. But they have actually absolutely been on repeat for me. Jim, what about yourself?
So this will show how my brain works. You know how, Jeff, you've known me long enough that I'll say something like, who was that guy that we met at that one client and they begin with the letter C, but I can't remember what their name was. So I do the same thing with songs in a similar way. So I was talking to Denise the other day and I said, what is that song where it's like, he's got greasy hair. It's like, he has greasy hair and a greasy smile. And then I looked it up. I'm like, oh, it's that John Cougar Mellencamp song, Pink Houses. So I downloaded it to my phone, and I love that song. I've been listening to it over and over again, at least once a day for about 2 weeks.
I will attest to the fact that your brain does work in weird and wonderful ways. That is for sure. I think that's probably a good spot to leave it on. We have a pretty good mix there for music. We got Pink, we got the Struts, we got John Mellencamp. I mean, what more could you want, right? I mean, that's everything. All right, so let's go ahead and leave it there. Julie, I, as always, appreciate you being on the show. Congratulations on your 3-time world champ repeat guest performance here on the show for us. And also want to let people know that they'll be able to get this report from the IDSA website. So I'll have a link to that in the show notes. What was that Twitter address again, Julie, that if people want to check that out, they can follow there too?
Yeah, at IDS Alliance.
At IDS Alliance. And then, for us on the show, right, you can visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com, and you can follow us on Twitter as well at IDAC Podcast. So with that, appreciate everyone listening, and thanks, Jim and Julie, for being part of this. And we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.